Welcome back, my loves, to another episode of Rewriting Romance, Modern Dating with Old School Wisdom, a space where we unpack modern dating and relationships through the lenses of faith, psychology, and feminine wisdom, exploring what true femininity and feminine power looks like when rooted by Christ and not shaped by the world. Because as we know, modern culture has a lot to say about relationships. It has a lot to say about identity, about love, about sexuality, about men and women and what they should want and how they should be dating and even what happiness should look like. But the question that we really should start asking ourselves is culture actually leading us to fruitful and healthy relationships, or is it actually furthering us away from that? Last episode, we had a very powerful conversation with our special guest, Lauren, where we dove into some topics that a lot of Christian women often feel like they really cannot talk about openly. We discussed marriage and what it looks like when God is not truly the center of a man leading that home, the painful reality of abuse within a marriage, and when scripture does allow that separation or divorce due to that abandonment or abuse, the emotional and spiritual difficulty of co-parenting with that toxic partner, and the challenges that Christian women are facing in this modern dating landscape. Now, these are conversations that many women are navigating quietly, often without any guidance or without a safe place that they can truly process what they're going through in a biblical lens. And what we are seeing more and more is that many of these challenges are not happening in isolation. They're actually happening within a larger cultural shift. A shift that has slowly changed the way that we are viewing relationships, the way that we are viewing connections, the way that we are viewing commitment, and even how we're viewing our own identity. Which brings us to today's conversation. Today, we're really going to start unpacking how the digital era and dating apps have shaped the way that we view relationships, attraction, and connection. Because whether we realize it or not, the environment that we are living in constantly is shaping us. It shapes what we're desiring. It shapes what we expect from others. And it starts to shape also how we're viewing love and even how we view ourselves. We live in the most digital connected generation in history, but yet loneliness is at an all-time high. We have more than ever ways to communicate, more ways than ever to meet people, and more ways than ever to stay connected. And yet many people feel more disconnected than ever before, more confused and more dissatisfied with relationships. So we should start asking ourselves, what exactly changed? And more importantly, how do we navigate dating without allowing culture to reshape God's design for relationships? So, ladies, grab your coffees and your teas, your journals and your Bibles, and let's dive right into it. But before we really start talking about dating apps, we need to really start stepping back a little bit and look at something bigger. Because the digital world is not something that we use. It's something that is constantly forming us. Every day we're consuming information. We're scrolling through social media, watching videos, reading posts, and seeing people's lives through a very curated snapshot. And while all of this may feel harmless, the constant exposure slowly starts to shape how we start seeing the world. It starts shaping what we think is normal. It starts shaping what we think success should look like. It starts shaping how we think love should feel like, what we believe that we deserve. And it even starts shaping what we believe about ourselves. And the truth is, we are always being formed by something. Either we are being formed by God and His truth, or we're being formed by the culture around us. And a lot of people think that they are just consuming content. They are just scrolling. They're just watching. They're just passing the time. But what they often don't realize is that consumption leads to formation. The things that we are repeatedly seeing, the things that we're repeatedly hearing and observing, it starts to shape our values and our expectations. And in many ways, culture has become one of the most powerful forms of modern discipleship. Not discipleship towards the truth, but more discipleships towards that humanly fleshly desire. Social media starts to train values like appearance, like status, like attention, validation, and that instant gratification. And over time, this begins to affect how we're starting to view our relationships instead of learning the values of character, patience, commitment, sacrifice, spiritual alignments. We begin to prioritize things instead that are more of attraction, excitement, emotional intensity, and how someone makes us feel in that particular moment. And this starts to really create a subtle shift in how we are approaching our relationships. And we are not asking the correct questions like, is this someone who shares the same values as I do? Is this someone who is pursuing Christ? Is this someone who has the character to lead and build a life with me? But we are asking questions more like, do they excite me? Do they give me those butterflies? Do they look good? Do they fit the image that I have in my mind? And social media only amplifies these types of questions and this type of mindset, right? Because what we're seeing online rarely is reality. It is a highlighted reel of someone's reality. We see the best momentums in people's life through these small engagements, through their photos, through the romantic trips, through these aesthetically pleasing date nights. But what we're not really seeing past that lens is the conflict. It's the work that they're putting in. It's their type of commitment. It's their type of sacrifice, if any, in creating a sustainable, long relationship, the things that are required for a long lasting, healthy relationship. And if over time we are not careful, we begin to compare our real lives to someone else's curated illusion, which creates an unrealistic expectation of what relationships should feel like. And another subtle way that social media shapes us is through validation culture. Platforms are built around feedbacks and loops, right? So the likes, the comments, the views, the matches. Each of these interactions gives our brain a small hit of dopamine. And over time, we become conditioned to seek external validation rather than the internal or spiritual grounding. This can quietly affect people and how they're dating. So instead of seeking someone who aligns more with our values, many people subconsciously begin seeking someone who's validating their own self-image, someone who boosts their confidence, someone that gives them the attention, someone who reinforces their identity. But relationships that are built primarily on that validation rarely lasts, because validation is not the same as compatibility or character. And this is when the digital environment begins to collide with dating. Because when culture begins forming our desires, it inevitably reshapes how we approach relationships, which leads us directly into this next part of our conversation. Because the same digital system that shapes our expectations have also created something new in the dating world: dating apps. And while dating apps are just simply a tool, the way that we use it often reveals how deeply culture has already shaped our mindsets when it comes to relationships. So, when culture begins to shape our expectation, and it doesn't just change how we see those relationships, it actually starts to shape how we're pursuing them. Because the digital world has not only shaped our desires, it also has shaped how we quickly are expecting those desires to be fulfilled. So, we now live in a culture that has trained our expectations with immediacy, right? So if we want food, we order it instantly. And if we want entertainment, we can easily stream it instantly. If we want information, we can pull up our phones and look at a search engine and find that instantly. And increasingly, if we want attention, validation, or connection, we are expecting that to be instantly too. And technology has slowly conditioned us to become uncomfortable with waiting, with patience, and with the slow process of building something meaningful. But relationships were never designed to function at a speed that technology does. Relationship requires the time, they require presence, they require intentionality. And when a culture becomes addicted to immediacy, it becomes much harder for people to cultivate that type of patience and discipline that real relationships require and can flourish, which that brings us to another major cultural shift. Because technology has not only accelerated how we are connecting, but it has also normalized a mindset of instant gratification. So one of the most defining characteristic of this digital age is that it has trained us to seek quick rewards and short-term pleasure. Social media, the digital entertainments, and dating apps all operate on the same psychological principle, and that is immediate feedback. You post something, you get likes. You send a message, you get a response, right? You swipe right, you get a match. These are systems that are designed to give a small burst of validation and excitement instantly. And while those moments may seem harmless, over time they really start to condition our brains to crave that constant stimulation and quick emotional payoff. The problem is that when this mindset starts to carry into our dating, it can fundamentally change how we start truly approaching those relationships. Because instead of approaching dating as something that requires patience, intentionality, and discernment, many people begin to approach it as something that that should feel excited, or it should be effortless, or it just should be an immediate reward. Technology has made things in life more convenient, but it also has trained us to expect instant communication, instant attention, instant validation, and in many cases, instant intimacy. And when everything begins to feel immediate, accessible, relationships can slowly become transactional. So instead of asking, who is this person? What kind of character do they have? Are we aligned in our values and the vision of our lives? The focus can shift towards more of, what can this person give me right now? Can they give me attention? Can they give me affection? Can they give me validation? Can they give me that physical intimacy? And in other words, dating can begin to resemble something closer to consumption rather than connection, where more people move quickly through interactions, searching for that next emotional high, rather than investing the time required to fully, truly know someone. And this is where dating apps enter the picture. Now, it's very important that I do clarify something. Dating apps themselves are not inherently bad. But again, technology is simply a tool. A tool can be used for good, or it can be used very poorly depending on the intentions of that person using it. There are many couples who have met through dating apps and have built a healthy, godly centered marriage. But tools tend to reflect the values of that culture that is using them. And when dating apps exist within a culture that already prioritizes instant gratification, validation, and pleasure, they can ultimately amplify those tendencies, which leads us to two common motivations people are bringing into the dating app world. So the first motivation is something very human: loneliness. Many people join dating apps simply because they do not want to feel alone. They may not necessarily have a clear vision of what they're technically looking for. They may not know if they want marriage, if they want commitment, or even if they want something long term. But what they do know is that they want connection. They want someone to talk to, someone to spend time with, someone to fill that emotional space and loneliness they have created. And while the desires for connection is completely natural, God created us for relationships and covenant. Dating without direction can often lead to confusion. When someone does not know what they are ultimately looking for in a relationship, they can end up moving through relationship to relationship without any clear intentions. And then they can start leading more into an emotional entitlement, mixed signals, and sometimes hurt on both sides. So, what's the second motivation? Motivation 2 is more directly tied to that sexual culture that has developed in modern dating today. For some people, dating apps are not primarily about building a relationship. They're more about seeking pleasure, validation, physical intimacy, and indulging in those fleshly desires. And dating apps provide something that previous generations did not have, and that is that immediate access to a wide pool of potential partners. This accessibility can make it easier for people to pursue that short-term connections without much emotional investments. Some people use dating app as a way to boost their confidence through matches and attention, experience a physical intimacy without commitment, or simply indulge in temporary pleasures. And in a culture where sexual boundaries have become increasingly blurred, dating apps can sometimes become another avenue where that sexual immorality is normalized and even encouraged. But this deeper issue here is not technology in itself, but more of that human heart. Because technology simply makes it easier for people to pursue what their hearts desire. And if our desires are shaped more by culture than by God, then by the way that we are approaching dating will naturally start to reflect that, which leads to this other important dynamic within the dating app. Because the design of these platforms doesn't just make connection easier, it also amplifies some of the deeper cultural patterns that we have discussed earlier. Patterns like comparison, disposability, and the belief that there's always something better just one swipe away. So, when we look at these motivations that people are bringing into these dating apps, Whether it's fear of loneliness or the pursuit of fleshly desires, we start to see something deeper happening beneath the surface. Dating apps didn't just change how people meet, they changed the environment in which dating happens. For most of human history, people met with relatively small social circles. Through family, through churches, through community, through work, or just shared life experiences. You met someone, and because your options were more limited, you were more likely to invest time in getting to know that particular person. But dating app introduces something completely new into the dating landscape: endless choice. And while this may sound like a really good thing at first, research in psychology shows that too many options can actually make people less satisfied with their decisions. And because people feel like they have this unlimited alternatives, it becomes harder to fully invest in any one choice, which leads us to what many psychologists refer to the paradox of choices. So, dating apps have created the illusion that there is going to be someone better one swipe away. And this subtle mindset can have a powerful effect on how people are approaching relationships. Instead of approaching dating with curiosity and that patient, many people are actually approaching it with a consumer mindset, where people are not necessarily looking deeply to know one another, but they're just browsing, evaluating, filtering, scrolling through potential partners the same way that someone might be scrolling through products online. And the mechanisms of dating apps reinforces these types of behaviors: the swipe left, swipe right, yes, no, accept, reject, all within matters of seconds. This format encourages people to make rapid judgments about someone based on extremely limited information. And often those decisions are made based on a few photos, physical attraction, a short bio, if you even read it, maybe just a single sentence about hobbies or interests, and most of us don't even look through that. You're just stuck on the physical aspect. And what rarely gets evaluated during these first moments are the things that actually matter to sustain a long-term relationship, which are things like character, emotional maturity, shared value, faith alignment, communication style, long-term vision for your lives. And in many ways, dating apps have reduced something incredibly complex, human connection, into something that can be evaluated within 3 seconds. And when that becomes the norm, it subtly trains people to think about relationships in a very different way. So we are not asking questions: is this someone I can grow with? We are asking questions more of, is there someone better out there? Right? Which feeds into that familiar mindset many people now carry into dating, and that is the grass is greener on the other side. But the grass only appears greener when people are constantly comparing what they have to what they could have. And when someone believes there are always better options just around that corner, it can become much harder to commit, to have that slow process of building something real with another person. And this dynamic has also contributed to some of the behaviors that have become increasingly common in the modern dating. Things like ghosting, avoiding difficult conversations, disappearing instead of communicating honestly, so avoiding confrontation. When someone views relationship through a consumer mindset, it becomes easier to treat people as replaceable. If something becomes uncomfortable, rather than addressing the issue or communicating clearly, people simply move to the next option. And part of this behavior is driven by something very human, and that's the fear of rejection. Studies have shown that roughly 56% of people avoid pursuing someone they are interested in because they are fear of that rejection. So instead of taking the emotional risk of communication, of expressing interest, or even respectfully turning someone down, many people just choose the avoidant route. They disappear, they ghost, they delay the conversation that is required for vulnerability and clarity. And over time, this pattern contributes to a dating culture where people feel incredibly disposable, where connection feels temporary, where people hesitate to invest emotionally because they fear that other people might disappear at any moment. But beneath all of these patterns of ghosting, comparison, endless swiping, there is another belief that quietly drives many people's decision in dating. A belief that has been heavily reinforced by movies, social media, and modern romantic narratives. And this belief that if someone is truly right for us, we should feel something immediate, an instant emotional connection, an undeniable chemistry, what many people refer to as the spark. And that brings us to this next conversation in the modern dating. Because while the spark may feel exciting at the beginning, it is often misunderstood and sometimes can be very misleading. After looking at how dating apps create that endless options and a consumer mindset around relationships, now with the spark, this drives another dating behavior. You hear that phrase all the time in dating conversations. People will go on dates and say things like, I just didn't feel the spark. There wasn't any chemistry. It just didn't feel like there was anything there. And because of that, they just move on. They assume that if the spark is not immediate, then that person must just not be the right one. But this actually starts to raise a very important question. What exactly is the spark? For many people, the spark is simply an initial emotional or physical attraction. It's the feeling of that excitement, of the butterfly in your stomach, a rush of curiosity or intrigue about that other person. And attraction is not inherently wrong, and attraction is natural part of human connection. But where modern dating goes wrong is when people treat the initial feeling as the primary indicator of a long-term compatibility. And when people believe that if the spark is not intense from the beginning, then the relationship's not even worth pursuing. The problem is that this mindset has been heavily shaped by the romantic storytelling through movies, TV shows, and our social media narratives with, social media influences in their romanticized lives. Stories where two people meet and instantly feel this undeniable connection that feels effortless and magical. But real relationship rarely unfolds like this. Real relationships are not movies. They are not built on constant emotional intensity. They are built out of commitment, character, intentional investments over time. In reality, the spark can serve a purpose. It can. It can actually initiate attraction. It can create curiosity about something, and it can open the door for connections. But what many people misunderstand about the spark is that it cannot sustain a relationship. Because emotional intensity fades, butterflies fades, the excitement of that newness eventually settles, and what remains after that initial stage of that newness is something far more important, and it's going to be character, values, trust, communication, and shared direction in life. And healthy relationships often do not start with the overwhelming fireworks. Sometimes they begin quietly, with conversation, curiosity, respect, with two people slowly learning about each other and start building that trust. This is what many relationship experts refer to as a slow burner, a connection that is deeper over time rather than exploding immediately with intensity. Slow burning relationships often have a stronger foundation because they are built through time spent together, trust that develops gradually, shared values that becomes clearer through conversation, intentional investments in understanding one another. So, in other words, the relationship is constructed, not something you stumbled upon, which is why a helpful reminder in dating is this: great relationships are built, not discovered. They are not something you simply stumble across fully formed. They are something two people initially cultivate over time. But when someone is constantly chasing that spark, something else starts to happen. They often never stay in long-term relationships to allow this connection to grow. So the moment things feel calm instead of exciting, the moment that the butterflies start to fade, the moment that the relationship requires patience rather than adrenaline, and then they start to assume that something is wrong. So they move on and then they start the cycle again. Another date, another match, another attempt to find the immediate emotional rush. But what they are often chasing is not compatibility. They are chasing novelty, and novelty always fades, which is why people find themselves stuck in this repetitive pattern in dating where relationships never seem to last. Not because the right person was never presented, but because the connection was never given enough time to actually deepen. And often this pattern is not just about attraction. It is influenced by deeper psychological patterns that many people carry into their relationships without even realizing it. Things like unrealistic expectations, fear of vulnerability, comparison, self-doubt. And these are what we might call the dating blind spots. Subtle mindsets that quietly shape how someone's approaching relationships and the choice that they are making. And when these blind spots go undiscoverable or unrecognized, they can sabotage otherwise healthy connections, which is exactly what we're going to be unpacking here next. When we look at the modern dating pattern, chasing the spark, endless swiping, ghosting, avoiding commitment, it can be tempting to think the problem is simply dating apps or technology. Not us. But often the deeper issue is something a lot more personal. It is the mindset that we are carrying into these relationships that we're not even realizing it. And many people approach dating with certain unconscious pattern or beliefs that quietly start to shape their decisions. And this is where the blind spots come into play. They are subtle ways of thinking that feel normal to us, but can actually sabotage healthy relationship before they even truly deepen. So let's go ahead and talk about these blind spots, and there are going to be 3 common blind spots that we're going to be unpacking here. And these are the romanticizer, the maximizer, and the hesitator. each one reflects different ways that people struggle to approach relationships realistically and intentionally. So, the romanticizer is someone who deeply believes the idea of love. They're lovers, right? But their expectations of love have often been shaped more by stories than by reality. They believe love should feel like a movie, like a fairy tale, like a constant emotional high. And in their minds, the right relationship should feel effortless and magical from the beginning. There should be instant chemistry, instant emotional connection, constant excitement. And while these feelings can absolutely be part of a relationship, the problem is when someone begins to believe those feelings must always be present in order for these relationships to be the right ones. This belief is heavily reinforced by modern culture. It's those romantic movies, the social media couples, the engagement announcements, the aesthetically pleasing dating nights, and those highlighted reels. What people rarely see is the reality behind those moments, right? So they don't see the difficult conversations. They don't see if there's any growth within the relationship. They don't see the compromises that there might be facing in their relationship. They don't see none of those conflicts that they may be facing behind the camera. And they don't see the patience that requires to build something lasting. So when the romanticizer encounters the normal rhythm of a real relationship or the reality of what it takes to grow a real relationship, moments that feel that calm or ordinary or even challenging, they may interpret this as the sign that something or someone is just not right or something's off. So instead of recognizing the relationship naturally move through different emotional seasons, they may start thinking, maybe this isn't it. Maybe the right person would make me feel more excited. Maybe I'm just settling. And because those expectations, they may start to walk away from relationships that could actually have grown to something meaningful and fruitful. And if we had given the time to actually develop into something meaningful like that. And unrealistic expectations often do sabotage those real relationships before they even have the space to even begin. So the second blind spot that we're going to be unpacking here is the maximizer. So the maximizer approaches dating with a constant underlying question. Is this the best option I can get? So instead of focusing on whether someone is a good match, the maximizer is often scanning the horizon, wondering if there might be something better on the other side. Signs of this mindset include constantly comparing partners, overanalyzing those small flaws, focusing more on what someone lacks than on what they are bringing to the relationship, always feeling uncertain about whether they should fully commit or not. This mindset has been significantly amplified by the dating app culture that we have been discussing throughout this episode. When someone is constantly exposed to hundreds or even thousands of potential matches, it can create the illusion that there is always a better option just around the corner. And this starts to create a psychological paradox because while endless options may seem like freedom, research shows that too many options often start to lead to less satisfaction and not more. So when people have too many choices, they begin to question every decision that they are making. And even when they choose someone that is wonderful, they may still wonder, did I choose the best possible person? And this mindset can start to prevent people to fully invest in a relationship that they are currently in. Because a part of them is always mentally comparing, always wondering if something better exists. But healthy relationships require something that the maximizer often struggle with, and that is the willingness to choose someone and invest in that choice, to stop scanning the horizon and stop comparing, and to start focusing and cultivating in the relationship that is right in front of them. So while the romanticizer struggles with the unrealistic expectations of others, and the maximizer struggles with the endless comparison, the hesitator struggles with something different: their self-doubt. The hesitator often believes that they're not quite ready to be loved, and their internal dialogue may sound something like, "Why would someone like them want to date me? I need to work on myself more before I pursue someone. I'm not attractive enough, successful enough, or interesting enough." At first glance, they can appear very humble, but over time, it can become a form of avoidance. Because if someone is constantly believing that they are not good enough, they may avoid putting themselves in situations where they could be vulnerable. They may avoid pursuing someone that they are interested in. They may avoid expressing their feelings. They may even sabotage relationships when someone starts showing genuine interest in them. And so the hesitator often leads to patterns like avoiding emotional vulnerability, pulling away when connections begin to deepen, or unconsciously pushing people away before they even have a chance to leave. But underneath this mindset is often a deeper identity struggle. When someone's sense of worth is shaped by comparison, rejection, or past wounds, it becomes difficult for them to believe they are worthy of that love. And when someone does not believe they are worthy of love, it becomes very difficult for them to receive it. And so what's interesting is that these three blind spots can exist simultaneously within the modern dating culture. Some people romanticize relationships, some constantly compare their options, and some doubt themselves and hold back. But underneath all of these patterns is something deeper, a deeper question about identity, about where we are learning what love should look like, about where we are learning what our worth actually is. And this brings us back to something foundational, because many of these patterns exist when our understanding of relationships and identity have been shaped primarily by culture rather than by God. And when culture becomes that primary voice shaping our expectations, it is very easy for our views of love, dating, and even ourselves to become distorted. Which is why this final part of this conversation brings us back to something essential. Because ultimately, the solution to a broken dating pattern is not just better strategies, it's realignment. Realignment with the way that God has originally designed relationships to actually function. And that begins by allowing Him and not culture to shape our identity and our desires. And after everything that we've unpacked in today's episodes, with the digital culture shaping our desires, the instant gratification mindset, the endless options of dating apps, the myth of the spark, and blind spots that many people are bringing into relationships, we arrive with an important realization. And the deeper issue in modern dating is not simply technology, as we have discussed. It is the formation. The question is not just how do we date? The deeper question is who or what is forming the way that we are thinking about love, relationship, and our identity. Because every human being is being shaped by something, by our culture, by our environment, by our experiences, and by our beliefs. And scripture speaks very directly to these realities. In Romans 12:2, Paul writes something incredibly relevant for the world that we are living in today. Do not be conformed by this world. Be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So there are two key ideas in this verse: confirmation and transformation. To be conformed means to be shaped by external pressures. It means slowly adapting the values, behaviors, and belief through environments around you. And that is exactly what modern culture does. Culture constantly sends messages about what love should look like, what attraction should feel like, what success in a relationship means, what men and women should prioritize. And if we're not intentional, we slowly begin to absorb these messages without really questioning them. We begin to think the way that culture wants us to think. We begin to pursue relationship the way that culture wants us to pursue. We begin to value what the cultural values are. But scripture calls believers to something different. Not conformation, but transformation. Transformation is not something that happens passively. It happens through the renewing of your mind, through intentionally replacing the narratives of the world with the truth of God. Which means if we want our approach to relationships to start reflecting God's design, we have to allow God, not culture, to shape the way that we are thinking. Now, Paul addresses another reality in Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So he explains that humanity often suppresses truth and replaces God with idols. Now, when we hear the word idols, we often imagine statues or ancient religious figures or practices, but idolatry is much broader than that. An idol simply is anything we place at the center of our lives instead of God. Anything that we are looking for identity, fulfillment, validation, or security. And in modern culture has created subtle idols with validation, with attention, pleasure, self-image. These are just things that many people are taught to chase. Social media encourages us to pursue this attention, and dating apps encourages us to seek validation. It glorifies our vanity, our inward looking, and our self-worshiping. Modern culture encourages us to prioritize pleasure and personal fulfillments above commitment and sacrifice. But when these things become the center of our lives, they slowly begin to distort the way that we are approaching relationships. So, how can we honor God in relationships? But we're asking questions of, how does this relationship make me feel? Does this person make me happy right now? Does this person validate me? It's all about me, 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 me. And when the personal gratification becomes the primary goal, relationships can easily become self-centered rather than covenant-centered. But the beauty of the gospel is that God does not simply point out where culture has distorted our thinking. He also provides the path towards transformation. So going back to Romans 12:2, transformation happens through the renewing of our minds, right? And so what does renewing of our minds really mean? And how can we intentionally allow God's truth to reshape what we are seeing, what we see in ourselves, what we see in other people, what we see in relationships, and what love is in itself. And so this renewal happens through spending more time in scripture, allowing God's word to challenge the cultural narratives that we're seeing, prayer and reflection, and surrounding ourselves with wise, godly community. Making intentional decisions that actually align with God's design rather than with cultural pressure. So, in other words, transformation requires intentional living. It requires choosing truth over convenience, choosing character over chemistry, choosing patience over instant gratification, and choosing purpose over impulse. And when our minds begin to align with God's truth, our approach to relationships begin to change as well. We stop looking for someone to fill that void. We stop chasing validation or excitement, but instead we start to look for relationships that reflect that mutual commitment, that spiritual alignment, and that shared purpose. And another important piece of God's design for relationships can also be seen in Acts 2:42 through 47, which describes the early Christian community. So it says, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe come upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need, and day by day attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes. They received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their numbers day by day those who were being saved. These believers lived in deep connection with one another. They shared life together. They supported one another. They prayed together. They held each other accountable. Relationships were never meant to exist in isolation. They were meant to exist within community, within the families, within the churches, within the circle of people who help guide, support, and encourage one another. But modern culture often promotes the opposite: isolation, digital interactions instead of real presence, superficial connections rather than deep relationships. And many people today navigate dating almost entirely alone, without mentorship, without accountability, without community speaking wisdom into their decisions. But God designed relationships to flourish within environments where people are known, supported, and guided by others who share their faiths and values. Because community provides something incredibly important: perspective. It helps us see what we might not be able to see in ourselves. It helps protect us from unhealthy patterns. And it reminds us that relationships are not just about two individuals, they exist within a larger context of God's people. So when we step back and look at the modern dating landscape, it can sometimes feel confusing and even discouraging. But the good news is this: God's design for relationships has not changed. Even when culture has shifted, even when the technology changes, even when dating trends evolve, God's design still centers on character commitment, mutual growth, spiritual alignment, and the love that reflects his nature, which means that as believers, we are called to approach dating very differently, not perfectly, but intentionally, allowing our desires, expectations, and decisions to be shaped by truth rather than by trends. Because when we allow God to shape our identity first, something powerful happens. We stop looking for someone to complete us. And instead, we begin looking to someone to walk alongside us as we both pursue Christ. So, as we step back and look at everything that we have talked about today and start to digest and reflect on it, the influence of digital culture, the instant gratification mindset, the endless choice of dating apps, the myth of the spark, and those blind spots that people are constantly bringing into their datings or in their relationship, we have one thing very clear, and that is that technology didn't create the brokenness that we see in today's culture. It simply have revealed and amplified what has actually already been in human hearts. Dating apps didn't create comparison, they magnified it. They didn't create the desire for validation, it just made it easier to chase that. They didn't create loneliness, but they often attempt to provide quick fixes that never truly address the deeper need for connection and purpose. And when we look honestly at the modern landscaping, what we often see is not just a technology problem, we are seeing a formation problem. People search for their identity, searching for their validation, searching for love, and often are searching in places that were never designed to fill this deeper need. Because the truth is, if we enter relationships looking for someone to complete us, validate us, or give us a sense of worth, we are placing the weight on that relationship that was never meant to carry. So, no human relationship can carry the weight of our identity. Only God can. And when our identity is rooted in Him, something powerful begins to shift in the way that we are approaching relationships. We stop chasing that attention. We stop chasing the emotional highs. We stop chasing the illusion that there is that perfect person that is suddenly going to make everything feel complete again. Instead, we begin approaching dating with clarity and intention, which leads to some important questions that I want to leave you with. Am I dating intentionally, or am I simply reacting to my emotions? Am I chasing validation, or am I pursuing covenant? Am I allowing culture to shape my expectations of relationship, or am I allowing God to shape them? These are not always easy questions to answer, but they are very necessary, because the way that you are approaching those relationships can often reveal what is actually shaping our hearts. And that good news is that God's design for love and relationships have not changed. Even in a digital world, even in a swipe culture, even in a dating environment that often feels confusing and discouraging, God's design is still rooted in that character, in that commitment, in that mutual growth and relationship that ultimately reflects in His love. So instead of asking, where can I find that right person? Maybe it's a better question that starts with, who is shaping the person that I am becoming? So I really hope that this episode resonated with you and has brought you clarity, and you are being pulled to share this episode with someone that you know might speak to. Definitely do it. Click that share button. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can also listen to the podcast on the go through Apple Podcast and Spotify Podcast. You can also follow on Instagram and TikTok for community. So don't forget to support this mission and help spread the word. And until next time, stay grounded in faith, rooted in grace, and as always, become that woman that God has created you to be.